Introduction: The Enemy with No Face. The World War I heating hack soldiers used to survive brutal winters. Welcome back to Historia Prime. Before we step into the trenches, hold one image in your mind. A soldier lifting a blanket so frozen it cracks like glass. Because when we imagine the First World War, we think of artillery thunder, machine gun rattles, and the deadly shriek of falling shells. Yet beneath that noise waited an enemy far quieter, far more patient, and just as lethal: the cold. By the winter of 1916, the Western Front had hardened into a frozen maze of misery. Temperatures plunged, trees stood like shattered bones. Clay-filled trenches became icy coffins, where the real battle wasn't just against bullets, but against the physics of staying alive. Every minute was a negotiation with heat loss. Every breath was a reminder that your own body was the last furnace you had. And when supply lines faltered, when coal disappeared, when a single flame could draw a sniper's eye, how did they survive? They improvised. They turned desperation into engineering. They became inventors in the dark. Today, we uncover the forgotten device that made that possible. A tiny, improvised heating hack, built from trash, still used in modern war zones, and powerful enough to boil water, dry socks, and keep men alive when the world around them froze solid. This is the story of the trench candle and the makeshift stoves born in the mud. A story about physics, ingenuity, and the simple truth that survival belongs not to the strongest, but to the most resourceful. A tin can, a strip of cardboard, and a spark, enough to defy winter, and enough to teach us something vital about staying alive when everything else fails. Part 1. The White Death. Before we can understand the heating hack that saved thousands, we have to understand the enemy it was built to defeat. And to do that, you need to step, just for a moment, into their boots. Picture yourself in a trench carved into the clay of Flanders. The water table is so high that the ground never truly freezes. Instead, it becomes a thick, icy sludge that swallows your boots and climbs slowly up your legs. The cold doesn't strike all at once. It seeps. First your skin goes numb, then your muscles, and finally your bones feel as if they're turning to stone. This was the perfect breeding ground for trench foot, a condition so devastating it led to tens of thousands of amputations across the Great War. Soldiers wrote about waking to find their blankets stiff as planks, frozen solid from the night before. Their food rations, meant to sustain them, became blocks of ice that had to be smashed apart with bayonets. Winter didn't just challenge them, it hunted them, and military doctrine offered little help. Whale oil to rub on your feet, socks rotated on a schedule. These measures did nothing to create warmth. They merely slowed down decay. Heat was the real currency, the one thing every soldier needed, and the one thing the battlefield refused to give. Yet the greatest threat wasn't the cold itself, it was the impossible trade-off it forced upon them. Because fire was life, but fire was also death. A single plume of smoke, curling upward from a dugout, could summon an artillery barrage. A flicker of light at night could reveal your position to a sniper. Every spark carried a price. So the soldier stood between two graves, freeze in silence or burn under enemy fire. And somehow, in that narrow space between despair and necessity, they found a third option. They reimagined what fire could be. They rebuilt it in secret, reshaped it with physics and desperation, and made it small enough, quiet enough, and clever enough to save lives without revealing a single glow to the enemy. They reinvented the fire. Part 2. The Anatomy of the Hack. Now that we understand the cold they were fighting, we can finally step closer to the invention that changed everything. Enter the trench candle, known to German soldiers as the Hindenburg Licht, the Hindenburg Light. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than trash, an empty ration tin tossed aside after a meal of condensed milk or tinned beef. Yet inside that scrap metal lived one of the simplest, smartest pieces of battlefield engineering ever created. To appreciate it, you have to think like a soldier with frozen hands and no margin for error. A normal candle offers a single wick and a thin flame, enough to see your fingers, not enough to warm them. But the men in the trenches didn't need a flicker of comfort. They needed a burner. They needed heat dense enough to dry socks, boil water, or thaw a ration brick before their bodies lost more energy than they could afford. So they asked a simple question. What happens if we make the wick bigger? The answer was transformative. Soldiers scavenged corrugated cardboard from supply crates and cut it into long strips. Then, with a precision born from desperation, they rolled those strips into tight spirals, snail shells of compressed air channels, and pressed them firmly into the tin. And here's where the physics turns ingenious. Corrugated cardboard isn't just cardboard. Those vertical ridges create hundreds of tiny capillary tunnels. When the soldiers poured melted wax or paraffin into the can, those tunnels came alive, wicking the fuel upward in every direction at once. Instead of one narrow wick, they had a whole forest of fuel pathways feeding a broad, powerful flame. When lit, the entire surface ignited. Steady, wind-resistant, rain-resistant. No flicker, no fragility. Just a controlled sheet of heat radiating from a container small enough to slip into a tunic pocket. And once burning, one of these improvised furnaces could last up to 8 hours. In a world where warmth could mean the difference between frostbite and another day alive, the trench candle wasn't just a clever trick. It was a revelation. A stove hidden inside a scrap can. A fire that could travel with you. A weapon against winter disguised as garbage. It was, in every sense, a pocket-sized furnace, and for soldiers trapped in ice and mud, it was nothing less than a miracle. Part 3. The Scavenger's Economy. Now that we understand how the trench candle worked, we face an obvious question. Where did they get the fuel to keep it alive? Because in the trenches of the First World War, nothing came easily. War is a landscape built on scarcity. You could not stroll to a shop. You could not request supplies. You took what the battlefield gave you, or you made do with nothing. And so a new culture emerged, one that every soldier understood instinctively, the art of scrounging. Men became hunters of scraps. They scraped the last flakes of paraffin from shattered lamps. They peeled wax from the seals of official letters. They even rendered animal fat when nothing else could be found. Every drop mattered. Every crumb of fuel meant minutes of heat, minutes of life. On the German side, the Hindenburg Licht eventually became standardized, manufactured in bulk with tallow and low-grade paraffin. But for the Allied soldiers, the trench candle was often a private invention, a DIY lifeline crafted from whatever fragments the war hadn't already swallowed. What makes this moment in history extraordinary is not only the engineering, but the social instinct that grew around it. Soldiers wrote in their diaries about clubbing together, pooling coins to buy a single Primus stove, or gathering wax rations into a shared pot. They didn't just warm themselves, they warmed one another. Heat became a communal currency, shared the same way you would share a story or a cigarette. And in that freezing hellscape, a tin can glowing with a small flame became the hearth of the trench, a place where hands thawed, where socks dried before a sentry took the next watch, where men boiled water for tea. Tea that wasn't just comfort, but survival, sterilizing water and warding off dysentery. Even trench pudding, a grim concoction of crushed biscuits, condensed milk and jam, owed its existence to these makeshift furnaces. It tasted like desperation, but it kept men alive. In a war defined by machines, steel, and mass destruction, the heart of survival often came down to something far smaller. A scrap of wax, a ration tin, and the willingness of soldiers to share warmth when the world refused to give them any. Part 4. The Evolution. Rocket Science in the Mud. The candle was only the beginning. It gave soldiers a pocket of warmth, a flicker of control. But to push back the full weight of winter, to cook real food and heat real spaces, they needed something far more powerful. They needed a stove. And this is where the ingenuity of the trenches becomes almost unbelievable. With no blueprints, no proper tools, and no safe conditions, soldiers began crafting what we would now recognize as rocket stoves. Efficient, high-draft burners made from nothing more than mud, scrap metal, and stubborn human will. They scavenged larger tins, biscuit boxes, even empty petrol cans. They punched holes in the bottom for air intake. Then they nested those tins inside one another to create a vertical chamber, a crude but effective chimney forged out of battlefield debris. To understand why this worked, we have to pause and consider the physics. A chimney is not just a tube, it is a force multiplier. Hot air rises, and as it climbs the column, it creates a vacuum at the base. That vacuum pulls in fresh, oxygen-rich air, feeding the fire in a continuous cycle called the stack effect. The result is a flame that burns hotter, cleaner, faster, and with far less smoke. And smoke, in the trenches, was death. A single drifting tendril could reveal your position to a sniper. A column rising from a dugout could summon an artillery strike. So a hot, clean, almost smokeless fire wasn't just convenient. It was survival disguised as physics. To refine their creations further, soldiers packed the outside of their stoves with pug, a crude mixture of mud, clay, and grass. The grass acted like rebar, preventing the clay shell from cracking under heat. The mud formed a thermal mass, absorbing warmth and releasing it slowly, long after the flames died down. This was engineering born from instinct, but it mirrored principles modern designers still use. On the British lines, entire cooking systems emerged. The camelback stove, built from petrol tins and thick layers of pug, could feed an entire platoon. These men had no instructions, no safety standards, no classrooms. What they did have were the skills they carried from home. Farm boys who understood airflow from tending barns, blacksmiths who knew heat by feel, factory workers who understood metal through their hands. And so, in mud-choked trenches, lit only by fear and flickering firelight, they reinvented thermal engineering. Not because they wanted to innovate, but because failing to do so meant freezing where they stood. Their stoves were crude, they were ugly, but they worked, and in the deadliest winter many of these soldiers would ever know, that was enough to keep them alive. Part 5. A Tale of Two Trenches. To truly understand how these heating hacks shaped survival, we have to recognize one crucial reality. Not all trenches were built the same, and that difference in design, born from two opposing philosophies, changed everything about how soldiers fought the cold. When you study the records, a stark contrast emerges. The British High Command treated trenches as temporary wounds in the earth, something to move through rather than live in. They feared that comfort would weaken the offensive spirit, so their trenches were often shallow, wet, and brutally simplistic. Walls slumped, water pooled. Nothing about these spaces invited heat to linger. The German approach was the opposite. They dug in with permanence. Their fortifications grew deep and layered, reinforced with timber and concrete. Along the Hindenburg Line, some dugouts dropped 30 feet underground, insulated from wind and shellfire. A few even had electricity, proper flooring, and wallpaper, an underground city forged out of war. And because of this, the tools for warmth diverged as well. German soldiers, protected in deeper structures, could use larger, heavier stoves built into the earth. Their heating systems became semi-permanent fixtures, able to warm entire rooms instead of just hands. Meanwhile, the British Tommy lived in a ditch closer to the sky than to shelter. For him, every flame had to be small, quick, concealable, and ready to vanish at the first warning. He depended on the humble trench candle, the tin can stove, or the infamous Tommy cooker, a commercial tin of solidified alcohol that was supposed to boil water but rarely delivered. One soldier joked that it took 2 hours to boil a pint, and that was on a good day with no wind. Yet that frustration sparked creativity. Time and again, the homemade hacks outperformed the official kit. A punched-out tin can, fueled by shavings and wax, could boil water faster, burn hotter, and stay lit in conditions the issued gear couldn't endure. It was the triumph of necessity over regulation, of field invention over bureaucracy. And in that contrast, deep bunker versus open ditch, permanent stove versus portable flame, you see the full spectrum of the wartime experience. One army built walls to hold heat, the other built ingenuity to chase it. Both were fighting the same winter, but they fought it in entirely different worlds. Part 6. The Deadly Cost. Up until now, this story has been one of ingenuity, of men fighting winter with nothing but scraps and stubbornness. But every act of survival carries a shadow, and in the trenches of World War I, that shadow settled quietly in their lungs. To understand the cost, picture a dugout no larger than a pantry. 4 men crouched together, shoulders touching, breath hanging in the frozen air. In the center, a trench candle burns, its flame steady, its warmth welcome, its fuel a grim mixture of dirty wax, animal fat, and low-grade paraffin. The men leaned toward it instinctively, grateful for the heat. But what they could not see was far more dangerous than the cold outside, because that little flame was releasing soot, dense, oily, and invisible in the dim light. Modern studies, some prompted by the recent resurgence of trench candles in the Ukraine war, reveal the truth those soldiers never knew. The smoke from these improvised heaters contains ultrafine particles laced with heavy metals, cadmium, lead, and hexavalent chromium. These are not harmless contaminants. They are Group 1 carcinogens, the kind modern industry is legally required to contain and monitor. Yet, in an unventilated bunker, the concentration of these toxins can exceed safety limits, not by double, not by tenfold, but by 1,000 times. So while the trench candle kept their fingers from freezing and their feet from rotting, it asked for a quiet payment. Every breath carried particles deeper and deeper into their lungs. Every night of warmth increased the silent damage, and the men, without knowing it, were trading frostbite today for chronic illness tomorrow. This was the tragic calculus of trench survival. Live through the night, at any cost, and trust that you would find a way to pay the bill later. But for many, that bill followed them home long after the guns fell silent. In the end, the same invention that saved thousands from the cold also carved an invisible path of suffering through the rest of their lives. A reminder that survival is rarely clean and never free. Part 7. Echoes in the present. So why does any of this matter now? Why spend time on a century-old trick made from cardboard and ration tins? The answer is disarmingly simple. Because history repeats itself, especially when the world grows cold. Right now, in the 21st century, on the front lines of Eastern Europe, soldiers are once again rolling corrugated cardboard into tin cans. Volunteers assemble trench candles by the thousands, shaping them by hand, just as their great-grandfathers did in 1917. The design has barely changed at all, and that alone tells us something important. Technology evolves, but human need does not. When the power grid collapses, when fuel lines snap, when logistics choke under stress, we return, instinctively, to the fundamentals. And this is where the lesson reaches beyond the battlefield. For the modern survivalist, the weekend bushcrafter, or simply anyone who wonders how they would cope in a blackout, the trench candle is not just history. It is a reminder that survival has always been built on principles rather than products. You do not need expensive gear to protect yourself from cold or darkness. What you need is knowledge. The same physics that warmed dugouts in Flanders can warm a campsite or a powerless home today. A hobo stove can be made from a cutlery holder or a discarded coffee can. A 72-hour emergency candle can be built from materials most people throw away. The rules of airflow, insulation, and fuel efficiency have not changed since the dawn of fire. They are timeless, universal, and waiting to be applied by anyone who takes the time to understand them. In the trenches, these hacks meant survival. In the modern world, they mean resilience. The quiet confidence that even when systems fail, you are not helpless. The soldiers of the past carved out warmth in the mud. Their stories invite us to do the same in whatever winter life throws our way. Conclusion: the indomitable spirit. As we reach the end of this journey, I want you to return to the face of the soldier who first dreamed this into existence. Picture him not as a legend, but as a shivering man in a ruined trench, cold, soaked to the bone, terrified and exhausted. He hasn't slept in 3 days. His hands tremble as he holds an empty tin of beef, something most of us would toss aside without a second thought. But he doesn't see garbage. He sees possibility. He tears a strip from a battered cardboard box. He scrapes the last stubborn curl of wax from a dying candle. With the quiet determination of someone who refuses to surrender, he presses them together inside the can. Then he strikes a single match. In that instant, everything changes. A small flame rises, heat blooms, and in a world trying desperately to freeze him into submission, he has carved out a moment of power, a moment of defiance. Because this heating hack was never just about warmth, it was about agency. In a war that treated soldiers like replaceable parts in a colossal machine, building your own stove, even one made from trash, was an act of rebellion. It was a reminder that survival is not only physical. It begins in the mind, in the refusal to let brutality dictate the limits of what is possible. That is the true lesson we inherit from the trenches. Beyond combustion, beyond physics, beyond scraps of cardboard and wax, lies something far more important: the resilience of human ingenuity. No matter how dark the night becomes, no matter how cold the wind cuts, we will always search for a spark. And more often than not, we find it. Thank you for watching Historia Prime. Before you go, consider this. If the power went out tomorrow and the heat vanished with it, would you know how to stay warm? Would you know how to take what looks like nothing and turn it into survival? If this story gave you insight, or if it reminded you of the strength humans have always carried, please like the video and subscribe. It helps us keep the fires burning here at the channel. Until next time, stay curious and stay warm.